Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth session of the Biodiversity Academy. This session will cover the nature-based solutions, carbon credits, and everything in between. We have four speakers with us. We're starting with a short intervention from Heitor who is the GYBN Policy Co-Coordinator and is an ecological economist. Heitor, would you like to start?
Yes, thank you very much, Ayadi, and thank you everyone for being here. It's a really pleasure to share this space with you, and thank you for sharing your time on this Saturday with us. I will share my screen with you, so just let me know if you're ready to see it, please.
Yes, we can see your screen.
So thank you very much. As I mentioned, you're specialist in the field of ecological economics. So this means that I work on the intersection between natural system and social systems. Today, I will do an open remarks regarding conservation of finance and specifically looking for solutions for close the gap with diverse values of nature. So first of all, I'd like to frame the problem. And for this, I trust that you are following the Biodiversity Academy and that you are indeed already familiar that we are facing a scenario of biodiversity loss crisis, whose negative impacts are unequally between different countries and social groups. And that at the same time, we live a moment where our dominant economic system both impact nature and are dependent on nature. So despite this evidence of nature contributions to people and business, both in short and long term, we might realize that the value of nature is often not recognized, being disagreed by countries and different organizations. So we might see that we now are facing a selection process between choose more nature contributions to people or less nature contributions to people. So we are facing this trade-off. A point for framing is exactly understanding that our political and economic decisions now give priority to a restrict set of values of nature that are associated with approaches based on market and monetary results. So regarding this, we might understand that causes and opportunities, both of these, they result from this crisis, this values crisis, and are closely linked to this way that we recognize and we incorporate diverse values of nature in all our decision-making process. So ecosystems and biodiversity management and governance process need to understand this, and the way that we are building and designing and co-designing our financial solutions should also follow this process of diverse values of nature. So I will mention about monetary and market-based approach and say a little bit about the problems that we are facing regarding this. So I would say that now we have the confirmation based on the last studies that we are facing a biodiversity finance gap between $711 billion per year until the year of 2030, if we want to fund nature conservation and nature restoration. So the main point for us is to understand where this money are coming from which places this money are going through, and how this process is designed together with different territories and different socio-ecological realities. So our importance here today is discuss exactly how this gap is being closed. And we might have different solutions. As we know, we have a lot of different carbon market solutions, understanding that decarbonizing our economy is, of course, essential for the process to increase climate and nature resilience. But at the same time, we need to pay a lot of attention because carbon markets at the same time are being opportunity for those who are unwilling to take much needed radical or ambitious steps to reduce emissions at sources can still buy climate mitigation actions of others. So we still are uncertain about the implications both for territory and ecosystems of the carbon markets process and how this imply large emitters and polluters to allow them to continue to emit. At the same time, we need to pay attention that we have this criticism to ensure that integrity and good practices on carbon markets is highly complex, sometimes almost impossible depending on the territory. So past experiences are showing that we have a lot of challenges and issues involved with this, both in additionality process, but also in disrespect for rights of territories, rights of indigenous and local communities, and different socio-ecological realities. So it potentially opens a floodgate to market-based solution that might generate resolutions that might be false solutions in this case. Other thing that we might see is the discussion about biodiversity offsets. And biodiversity offsets are defined as conservation activities designed to compensate residual impacts on development on ecosystems that might persist even after other reduction or mitigation measures. So offsets are usually built around the idea of net or no net loss, but this is an assumption that the damage to ecosystems caused by large-scale development projects can be balanced or can be replaced or compensated by conservation or restoration in nature in elsewhere. So at the same time, we might have a criticism regarding this because biodiversity offsets are highly prone to reduce complex life forms and landscapes to negotiable statistics. So this can crowd out people intrinsic or relational values. This means values that people give for nature itself or values that people gives for this relation and interaction with nature on conservation and restoration projects. So we might pay attention that biodiversity offsets might repeat mistakes over these last 30 years that we have experimented with carbon markets projects. So I would say that we might see these implications on monetary and market-based approaches are basically focused on previous experiences that are unsuccessful, the ignore of uniqueness of each ecosystem's services, ecosystems functions and benefits, that ecological conservation and restoration might not produce the result expected by compensation because we are talking about complexity and different relationships between nature itself and between nature and people, and that market-based approach in most of the times ignore different perspectives or intrinsic and relational values of people and communities in their territories. So we advocate here for this perspective of diverse values of nature and how can we make the invisible visible. So recently, IPBES have launched their assessment on nature, diverse values and valuations of nature, where we see that over time and around the world, people have developed many ways of understanding and connecting with nature. So this leads us for a large, diverse values of nature and its contributions to people. So we might understand that we have different worldviews that depends on the way that people relate with nature, more in an anthropocentric way, or more in an ecocentric way, or more in a pluricentric way. At the same time, that have broader values that guide our actions to justice, to stewardship, to careness with nature. And we have specific values related in terms of the instrumental values, the relational values, or the intrinsic values. This means the way that we are giving our actions and feelings about nature. So we need to understand that this broad complexity needs to be put together with the conservation finance design. Otherwise, we will be denying a lot of diverse values. And this means that we are denying our possibilities or how to build living in harmony with nature truly perspective. So what were we talking about when we are talking about transformative conservation finance? We are talking exactly about this opportunity for create positive impacts for both people and nature. So we are talking about stopping the same. We are talking about truly action, about environmental justice, and about putting nature as central and putting local communities as central of all our decision-making process. So for those projects who are already going on and might not be stopped or recovered anymore, we need to search for strong socio-environmental safeguards. Socio-environmental safeguards, and they need to be conducted all stages of all projects and programs related with conservation finance, from the design, from the implementation, from the monitoring to evaluation. This means during the whole process, they need to be consented, they need to be free, they need to prior, inform, and be in a good faith. So socio-environmental safeguards, they must be understood as these priority requirements that aim to reduce negative impacts and enhance positive impacts related to conservation finance. So it's important to differentiate that this is not a standard or implementation guidelines, but this is safeguards in the way that must relate with this relation with negative and positive impacts. So this basically means some perspectives we just pointed for here, but we might have more or less dependent on the territory and the socio-ecological reality. But this means that we must respect cultural generation and gender protagonism and indigenous peoples and local communities protagonism. We must guarantee rights, prosperity, and sharing of benefits. We must guarantee conservation of biodiversity, which means that climate solutions without nature are not solutions. Monocultures and processes related only with climate are not solutions for the whole complexity that we might face. And for territorial development and screening of the local government structure, which means a long-term vision of conservation finance. Programs and projects must go and be co-designed with territories with a guarantee that these territories will have a long-term development in their own terms, not in only Occidental and in our industrial development concept. So finally, we might see this structure of transformative conservation finance as a diverse approach where we have different opportunities to integrate different financial instruments and to integrate financial solutions. So we might see in this fluxogram that all the transformative conservation finance are put inside of a strong social environmental safeguards in the whole process. This goes for the beginning and to the end of the project. And at the same time, all transformative conservation finance must guarantee stranded community arrangements. Stranded community arrangements are the place where indigenous peoples, local communities, and different socio-ecological realities may go to two different pathways. They can guarantee biodiversity conservation because their own relationship with nature, and these are our opportunity to enhance nature contributions to people that are related with non-structured markets. Non-structured markets are markets that are not already structured for nature and that must not or should not be structured because they are very complex. So here we open a door to understanding how we can understand conservation finance in a perspective related with official development as assistance, as the GEF projects, philanthropic donations and grants and other family offices. How can we understand these to public budget and disbursement for fiscal finance structures? And how can you understand a broadly perspective for payments for ecosystem services that do not compensate nature as a statistic, but actually compensated the relationship of careness and stewardship that people have with nature. On the other side, these stranded community arrangements also can produce us social biodiversity productions, which usually means product and services related with social biodiversities. as we may see different social biodiversity chains all around the world. These are already related with structured markets and can be an opportunity for us to understand how can we create impact investments, how can we create microfinance, loans, equities, debits, and green bonds, which means how can we use our usually and day-to-day finance structure, our status quo finance, to convert it for a more positive impact regarding to nature. Both of these pathways must go together, must go side by side. And conservation, biodiversity conservation, and social biodiversity productions are two options for a same solution that must go together. The strength community arrangements, of course, that needs to go with other non-monetary supports for strengthening local governance and also for have different perspectives on ecological, economic, and social cultural benefits, which means capacity building, development of other kinds of innovations, and so forth. So this might be some complex, but I hope we have more time on Q&A to discuss. And with this, I would say that this is our considerations on our youth side, or on GYBN side, and GYBN youth is consultancies to say that ecosystems are not replaceable, our land is not for sale, our rights must be respected, we need to think long-term, and the interests of power and the elites are not ours. So I use these opening remarks to invite the other speeches to go in the same direction and to pay attention in the truly conservation finance solutions that might be and must be transformative. So I thank you very much for the space, and I hope we all have a good session.
Thank you so much, Heitor, for the call to action, and so cool and so comprehensive again. We're moving quickly to the next speaker, but I again encourage everyone, as Heitor said, please add your questions in the chat. We have the Q&A session in the very end of the session. The next speaker we have is Bulimo Peter. Bulimo is an environmentalist working in the Nature Climate Justice Nexus and is currently serving as the project co-coordinator for Youth for Nature's Inuka project, currently being piloted in Kenya. The floor is yours, Bulimo.
Thanks, Ayadi and Heitor, for that presentation. I significantly relate with most of what you talked about. Ayadi, if you might allow me to share my screen, I'll go ahead. Okay. Ayadi, could you confirm that you can see my screen?
It's visible.
Thank you very much. Hey, just a minute. Just a minute. So yeah, we will talk about biodiversity financing mechanisms. From a youth perspective, of course, my name is Bulimo Peter. I am a youth environmentalist. I studied environmental science in Kenyatta University and further pursued a postgraduate certificate in tropical forest landscapes, restoration, conservation, and sustainable use from the Yale School of the Environment. I am currently working with Youth for Nature, implementing the Inuka pilot that is currently in progress in Kenya, hoping to scale further to Africa and other global South countries. Just a minute. Okay, allow me to stop sharing. I'll just quickly set up something. Okay. Right. Sharing. Trying to put it in full screen mode. Yeah. Okay. Sorry for that. So quickly, we will be looking at the missing middle in biodiversity financing. We will also be looking at the current state of biodiversity finance, a brief overview of the relevant financial options. At a high level, we look at natural capital, carbon, and the cash flows and the complexities therein. And finally, we'll conclude with the place of the young people in this whole discourse. So to begin with, I am sharing my screen for a quick Mentimeter for you to fill in. For the interest of time, I'm not sure we'll be able to project our answers, but kindly, if you would want, kindly go onto menti.com and enter that code. Alternatively, you could scan the QR on the screen, and then you could let your responses flow in, and then I might ask Ayadi towards the end of the presentation to let us know what your thoughts were on this particular question from the Mentimeter. But kindly, in the meantime, allow me to proceed for the interest of time. In the prospects of biodiversity financing, we want to envision it as a bridge that is broken, and in one end there is biodiversity, but from the other end we have conservation, restoration, management, and sustainable use. And the question then would be, what is the missing middle in this whole prospect? And to better understand this, I will want to indulge you in a particular saying that I got from my mentor that said, conservation without financing is just conversation. So then again, understanding that there is a really pivotal role that then finances play in ensuring the conservation, restoration, management, but also sustainable use of biodiversity resources. So to better understand this, then I'd want to ask what is the current state of our biodiversity financing. And to better understand this, I'll put it in the context of the SDGs, because nature and biodiversity are intrinsically interlinked to the SDGs and the goals that they're trying to achieve. So currently there is a 2.5 trillion annual gap in achieving the SDGs, yet the SDGs provide about 5 to 7 trillion in opportunity for investment. But you would wonder, the total global assets under management currently are 268 trillion. Yet high net worth individuals hold about 70 trillion of all these assets. It's quite devastating that only just under 1% of assets under management will completely finance the SDGs, yet the SDGs and nature by extension continue to be grossly underfunded. And we all agree that nature is inalienable to the SDGs because of the ecosystem services it provides, and 3.2 billion people who are directly depending on it, also providing approximately 40% of the whole climate solution. If you look at nature in terms of economic values and the economic benefits that it accrues, about 125 trillion worth of economy value can be derived from nature, and it can provide even 20 times more in terms of societal returns. Yet only about 80 billion is invested in nature and the environment. This is just a graphical representation to show how finances and the flow of finances to support and fund nature and biodiversity conservation has been occurring in the recent past, with the red highlighting the lower range, while the gray highlighting the red highlighting the upper range, while the gray highlighting the lower range. And you could see from 2015 it was about 67 billion in US dollars, and in 2017 it rose a little to slightly around 80 in average of the financial support that has been injected towards the sustainable development goals and nature in particular. But then if you look at this vis-a-vis the figures that we have been seeing in the previous slides, then you see that there is a very significant gap in funding. And you want to ask yourself, why is biodiversity grossly undercapitalized? And there is a number of reasons that can try to make pointers towards this particular concept. And then the first and the most obvious reason is the base of the pyramid problem. And the base of the pyramid problem talks about the pyramid of the world population structure and the socioeconomic structure of the world, where a lot of resources is concentrated in relatively small number of hands, and now redistributing these resources to the vast majority of the population at the bottom of the pyramid really becomes a problem. Another challenge is the geography problem, where many investors want to invest in countries that are already industrialized, countries that are considered low-risk areas, whereas most of the biodiversity investment is required in low-income areas, which often get identified as high-risk areas. Another challenge is the asymmetry or size scale problem, where many investors want to cash out their monies or investment in large amounts, while the projects that you and I, and especially the young people that are trying to do, are in pretty relatively small chunks, and which investors are not very keen towards funding. So then how do we sort of make them understand that we also need to support small scale projects? Another problem is the due diligence problem, because if you invest in something, you want that guarantee of a return on investment, but then how do you make your case for that particular investor? But also, how does that investor prove that you are capable of doing that, which is needful, and actually submitting to your end of the bargain? Another challenge, just quickly, is the unicorn versus tourist problem. Many investors want to go to investments that have huge returns in a very short period of time, whereas most investments in nature are very slow-paced, and the returns, of course, takes close to a generation to realize, and then many investors don't have the patience to wait that long. So that, again, becomes a problem. And finally, last but not least, there is the market failure problem, which nature has in many instances been considered as a public good that can be accessed for free, which discourages investment as it is, because then if something can be accessed for free, why then should we put our money into it? So now, with that background, then what are the available sources of finance? But even as we go into looking at these sources of finance, we need to understand that most current financial systems as they exist still continue to perpetuate the neocolonial capitalistic mentality that really poses a lot of pressure on people to price nature as a commodity from which they only want to accrue or derive the benefits for economic gains, as opposed to trying to understand nature from its intrinsic value that it provides to both humanity, but also the ecosystems that are thriving around it. So just for context, biodiversity financing, it refers to the mechanisms and strategies that generate, manage, and deploy financial resources and align incentives to achieve biodiversity conservation, management, and sustainable use outcomes. And there are a number of options to acquire biodiversity financing, and this can be either private or public, can be domestic or international financing options. And the international public sources, of course, include the multilateral funds, such as the Global Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund. We have the multilateral development banks, such as the Africa Development Bank. But we also have domestic public sources, including national banks and the national funds that have been set up to support biodiversity conservation. Some of the funders that are very conspicuous in this space include the Green Climate Fund, of course, the Global Environment Fund, the Africa Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and the list goes on. But even as you engage with these funders, you also need to kind of try and assess how their financial flows are working. You would understand that currently, for example, the World Bank as a multilateral funding agency is currently on the spotlight because of the current proposition to have the loss and damage fund temporarily hosted there. And this is because of their perpetual investment in fossil fuels and the effects that then they revert back to nature and ecosystems and or the communities that depend on it. So again, this is also like a good time to kind of try and do your due diligence on this financial resources and call them out in case you feel they are doing that which is not inconsistent with sustainability of biodiversity, nature, or in line with the sustainable development goals. Just quickly, I'll showcase to you a graphical representation of how the different financial flows have been operating within the biodiversity financing space. And you can see we have the domestic budgets taking the gross of financing nature and biodiversity, but we also have nature-based solutions. We have the natural infrastructure, which we will be talking about later as the natural capital. But we also have biodiversity offsets, green financial products, and a whole array of financial options. And this is just from the 2019 survey, and there's whole lot of depictions to express how the trends of biodiversity financing are happening. But even with that depiction, you would realize that there is not a single entity that has like sufficient capital to finance biodiversity. There is money in philanthropy, of course, but there is also money in private sector. But there's simply not enough goodwill, charitable money to deal with the order of magnitude, the issues of the SDGs and biodiversity in particular present. The only place where trillions of dollars fly naturally is the private sector, but the private sector is not a charitable entity. So then how do we bring in a bit of donor capital, the private sector capital, the national funds and all that to sort of eliminate the risk and increase the ability of private investors to see incentive and invest in biodiversity? That is where blended finance come in. And in so to speak, the blended finance just simply combines public and private sector finance to help offset risks and distribute benefits so that then you can be able to grow a pool of finances and then use that to generate cash flows that can then move forward the work that you are doing. Ayadi, you also try to help me with time in case I am overstaying. Okay, so one example of blended finance, of course, is the Melalui Fund in Indonesia, and I'll not go into the details of this, but I'll just urge you to check it out. We will share with you this presentation, and you can be able to see how they have combined different financial options to sort of eliminate risk and increase cash flows within the biodiversity space. But also another example is the Inuka project that we are doing, and I'll be able to talk about it in just a small overview at the end of this presentation. Sorry. But to put things into a little bit more perspective, I would like to just point out something small about natural capital, which is another term for the stock of renewable and non-renewable resources that combine to yield or flow of benefits to people. It links the benefits from ecosystem services with ecological, economic, social, cultural values that provides us with the health, security, and prosperity that we use to thrive in our day-to-day life. Natural capital, in essence, includes the role of the environment and ecosystem in supporting human well-being. And so to understand the value of natural capital and the way it is related to biodiversity financing, then we don't have an option but to understand how it is related to the general ecosystem service that we accrue from nature. And some of the ecosystem services, of course, are very common and you are familiar with them, including the provisional, regulatory, cultural, and supporting services. And so how do these services that are accrued from nature come in to support livelihoods, but also generate benefits for communities and nature itself? And how is it also interlinked to the ecosystem economics? So sorry, to understand that, then there are also some very important terms that you need to understand, which include but are not limited to ecosystem accounting and the natural capital accounting, which in a nutshell just simply try to draw the complex interlink between communities and the economic benefits derived from ecosystems and the need to account for these benefits economically in order to see how best these resources are managed for sustainability, because otherwise, if not managed and monitored, then there is that possibility of the tragedy of common, where people will go into nature or ecosystem and derive all the benefits without caring of how this will be replenished or without any accountability safeguards in place. And so to better put this into perspective, you'd want to know that natural capital exists as private or public goods, and also as renewable and as non-renewable resources. Private goods are excludable and rival, which means that if you acquire it, I cannot acquire it. You acquire it so that I don't derive benefits out of it. And a good example is like the public land which someone buys, then it becomes a private land. So when you own that particular land, then I cannot own it. But then how are these complexities of public and private good related to sustainability and the way we manage our natural ecosystems? We need to find ways to incorporate economic costs and benefits of natural capital into our sustainable financial system. This would help us prevent overexploitation and ensure that we have preserved the natural capital so that the coming generation can equally accrue benefits from this natural capital as have we during our lifetime. And of course, understanding the concept of sustainability is managing resources in a manner that will not deprive or rather the future generations from accruing the same benefits. And so with that particular example, I will now want to a little bit just focus on carbon and cash flows in the context of the natural capital, and also for you to try and understand how the complexities in natural capital has perpetuated, the unsustainable exploitation of these natural resources in a way that has not been very sustainable and has derived a lot of vulnerabilities within the ecosystem, which in essence prevents biodiversity from thriving in the long run. So a balanced atmosphere is a public good and climate change is a public bad. Emissions are negative externalities, whereas sequestration is a positive externality. Terrestrial carbon production is not the same as carbon consumption and not similar to a country's and its citizen carbon footprint. Reducing emissions to net zero will not stop causing climate change. In fact, it can make it worse if it shifts from production with imports from countries that are more carbon polluting. And I'll again go back to the example that I gave. For example, you're an investor and you decide to acquire land. That land was, say, a public land, so anyone could access it, but you acquired it and then it became a private land. So the moment you make a land private, you have made it excludable and rival. But the challenge comes in when you start manipulating that land for economic gain. The land has become private, but the externalities that are accruing from that land, for example, the carbon and emission that are coming from that land, then become a public good, even though your land is a private good. And this public good, there is a way that they have effects on people who are not even engaged in the process that you are doing within that particular piece of land. So the challenge with the carbon and the cash flows and the offsetting that comes here is that people usually tend to imagine, because this is your land and this is the emission that you're producing, then you can make that emission a private good, which you can own and then derive value so that you can trade it to be able to offset, to be able to emit more, when that emission in essence is actually a public good which can be accessed by everyone. And to further explain that, The development of carbon markets assume that carbon, a public good, can be transposed into a private good, and hence a private property right can be created, legally defined, and traded. It is immediately obvious that this full privatization is not just impracticable, but it's also undesirable. Yet to do this, private developers and also states pretend that carbon is excludable and rival. It pretends that a person or a company can own a ton of carbon, which others can be excluded, and that if this person or company consumes the ton of carbon, others cannot. So in any serious climate change policies, there should be measures both to reduce emission and to increase sequestration. One is not simply a substitute of the other. Yet the carbon trading scheme, this is not what it tries to do. Most of the carbon policies as they exist right now, they are trying to use emissions reductions as an alternative to sequestration, yet they need to ensure that we achieve both. Offsets that facilitate greater emissions are undesirable in any climate change policy. So there is need for proper policies that not just put people and planet over profits, but also demystify these complexities, especially for custodianships of the future, you and me, the young people who will be the custodians of the future. I know this is a pretty complex topic, but I'm very happy to delve into a more detailed conversation with you one-on-one. Of course, you will be able to send Ayadi those questions and we'll be able to tackle them in more details. And just to put what I've mentioned to more realistic terms, I have attached a link to this presentation, which shows what actually the complexities of this carbon trading have done, particularly, for example, for the Kenyan people. The Ogieki people are being evicted from their land to create room for the government to earn carbon credits from the land that they have been conserving for a long time. So the complexities of this carbon and the carbon trading that it brings, it perpetuates vulnerability, it perpetuates false solutions, it perpetuates greenwashing and all other things, land tenure, human rights, land tenure rights, and everything that is associated with land, which, because of the complex nature of the carbon and the carbon markets, makes the local communities unaware, and the benefits coming to a few people at the expense of whole communities. So aside
Bulimo, sorry for the interruption. I was messaging you about the same, but we have run over. I would appreciate if you could wrap the presentation up. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so just to conclude, I'll just simply mention the place of youth in this whole discourse, and it's simply like the project that we are doing, which is the Inuka project. And Inuka project has 3 goals: biodiversity and NBS best practice, sustainable livelihoods, and youth leadership and community building and storytelling. But I'll just want to mention a particular component of sustainable livelihoods and youth leadership, which we are trying to provide training and micro-granting for young people, of course, understanding the complexities within restoration, within nature-based solutions, and how young people are coming in. And so we are trying to give them training and financial resources to be able to do this restoration in an effective way, but also with the micro grants to ensure that the funding, number 1, reaches the grassroots, but also number 2, that they are able to use this funding to generate cash flows and benefits that benefit both communities and their livelihoods. So it is a project that really wants to work with young people and communities, and you can reach out to us to understand more how this project works. We have our social media handles at Inuka Africa through Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and also LinkedIn, but you can also reach out to me through bulimo.inuka@youthfornature.org or inuka@youthfornature.org. I know my colleague that was here before talked about Youth for Nature, so I'll not go into that detail, but just to ask you to look at the resources that we have shared here, and in case there is any question or concern, I'll be able to respond to it privately. I am very sorry, Ayadi, for taking so much. I think there is just so much to talk about here, but happy to continue this conversation some other time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bulimo, for that loaded presentation. And I can see in the chat that people are just so interested to reach out to you and also a lot of questions dropping in for you. So again, thank you so much for coming here. The next presenter we have with us would be Ms. Devashree Nirola. Devashree is a researcher and outreach specialist at the G20 Global Land Initiative of the UN-CCD, who has tons of work experience in the space of disaster risk reduction, climate modeling, remote sensing, community-based adaptation, and a lot more. She will be presenting on the UN-CCD over here. Okay, I will start presenting. And it's your space, Devashree. Take it ahead.
Thank you so much, Ayadi, and let me know if I'm audible or not. Also,
Yes,
can
you're
I
audible.
my presentation?
Yes.
So thank you for this great opportunity, and I see that the chats are loaded with a lot of questions. Also super interesting to hear all the presentations before. Extremely interesting session. Okay. Hi, everybody. I am Devashree Nirola. I'm the Research and Outreach Specialist of the G20 Global Land Initiative Coordination Office of the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, UN-CCD. At this particular event, I'm also talking on behalf of PEDRR Network. The G20 Global Land Initiative is a PEDRR partner. Next slide, please. So just to give you a brief about my presentation will be, or the talk will be divided in two sections. One is the generic part as to why is financing important in restoration. And then I'll be talking about the G20 Global Land Initiative coordination. What do we do in our daily work? And I know that Ayadi mentioned that there are a lot of young people here amongst our attendees, and I would like to showcase what opportunities we have and what sort of work do we do at the G20 Global Land Initiative and how you can be engaged. Right, so without any further ado, let's talk about why is it important to restore land. As of today, currently 2 billion hectares of land have been lost of their productivity. We know that 24 billion metric tons of fertile soil is being lost every year, and 23% of global land surface is suffering from reduced productivity. 10% of crop yield reduction, which leads to 18.5% of global greenhouse emission. 6.3 trillion loss of deforestation and land degradation, and 32 billion people are threatened of food insecurity, which also leads to 50% of global GDP that has been being affected. Next slide, please. Right. So given that land degradation has such an impact in the world, restoration really outweighs the benefits of, restoration benefits really outweighs the cost. So restoring 150 million hectare can generate about 85 billion net benefit to the national economy, 30 to 40 billion extra income for smallholder farmers per year, and additional food for close to 200 million people. Looking at what sort of benefits can restoration provide, including including water quality, providing sustainable timber, fiber, and fuel, improving soil health, improving food production, creating rural jobs, improving biodiversity, improving air quality, helping mitigate climate change, and creating recreational opportunity. Next slide, please. Right. So according to the Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, there have been 61 countries involved in different pledges to restore land. There are 74 pledges that have been made, and this very good map shows the pledges that have been made. So restoration practice can improve soil health and lead to global average increase in crop yield of 2% by 2050. And so of all of these pledges that have been made, there is, if you look at it in hectares, then it's 210.12 million hectares that have been pledged. Next slide. However, although there have been pledges made, but the global funding for conservation or restoration is falling short. Now, compared to a few years, there is still the financing in terms of restoration is still gaining some sort of attention, and there is increasing financing, but still the global conservation or restoration funding that is shortfall is about 300 billion per year. And if you look at how much money is being invested, the public fund is 41 billion, but whereas the private fund is just 10 billion. And that's one particular market that we can really tap onto. I think one of our previous speakers also talked about how can we make an appealing case as to inviting private funding and private sectors to be involved in restoration and conservation activity. So well, this is also a matter of interest for our initiative, for the G20 Global Land Initiative and for UN-CCD. Can we go to the next slide, please? Right, so now I take this opportunity to jump into what our initiative does. Yeah, so how do we address all of these issues that we've mentioned before? Next slide. So the G20 Global Land Initiative, the full name, G20 Global Land Initiative on Reducing Land Degradation, Enhancing Conservation of Terrestrial Habitat, was launched by the G20 group during the Saudi presidency of 2020. So every year, one particular country is hosts the G20, where they are considered the presidency. And this particular initiative was launched in 2020 during the Saudi presidency, with a very bold commitment of restoring 50% degraded land, or halting of 50% degraded land by 2040. And this is a global commitment, and it includes the entirety of the world and not just limited to the G20 countries. The commitment continues through the Italian presidency in 2021. Then we went to the Indonesian presidency, where they had the biggest mangrove restoration initiative, and now in the Indian presidency, where we've looked at how the basic initiative that they'd taken was for mining restoration and restoration of land that has been degraded by forest fire. Next slide, please. Right, so as I said, it is a global initiative, and it includes restoration of entirety of the world, but also including actors from private sector actors, youth actors, academia, and various other stakeholders. Next slide, please. Right. Now, since we are here from Youngo, and this is an interesting aspect for us, how is these three conventions related? How is UNFCCC, UN-CCD, and CBD related? And I want to put a bit of an emphasis on this, because now we are moving to the climate COP28. And it's also important for us to understand how is not just these three conventions, but how are the agendas related. We go back to the Earth Convention of 1992, where these three Rio Conventions were established. All of these three conventions have their own COP. So if you talk about COP, and if you just say, I'm going to the COP, it could mean COP of any of these three conventions. So the COP that we are looking at, that's happening in December in Dubai, is the UNFCCC's COP, the climate COP. whereas UN-CCD, the land COP, is happening next year, and that's COP 16. So the idea of these three Rio conventions is to work in synergy. And to address important issues such as climate change, such as land degradation, issues with land, such as conservation of biodiversity. And these three conventions work in synergy. And if you really look at what is that one place where all of these three conventions fall in synergy is actually land. So addressing land restoration and financing and land restoration in turn addresses climate change, addresses conservation of biodiversity, and also addresses land restoration. Next slide, please. UN-CCD is hosting the SDG 15, which is life on land. But if you look at SDG 15 and its synergy with other SDGs, then we address SDG 2, which is zero hunger, SDG 5, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, decent work and economic growth, SDG 9, 11, 15, 17, and others. Next slide, please. Going to the objective of the initiative, the three objectives of our initiative is: number one, conservation, conserving land and halting habitat loss, fragmentation, and land degradation. Number two, sustainable land management, so promoting integrated, sustainable, and resilient land and landscape management. And number three, land restoration. Restoring degraded land and seeking for collaboration, in particular to SDG 15, and the particular target that we're talking inside SDG 15 is SDG 15.3 that relates to land degradation neutrality, which is again a pivotal concept in UN-CCD. Next slide, please. And the key activities that we do through our initiative and that we address through our initiative is number one, to showcase land conservation, sustainable management and restoration website that we've created. We're working in an information sharing hub, one-stop shop where you can find best cases of land restoration. You can find what are the different initiatives. You can find data sets that are all around the world, and that will be stored in this information hub of ours. Number two is fostering collaboration. And we also believe that we need to work together and in synergy, not just with the 3 Rio Convention, but with other initiatives: Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, Wetlands International, grassroots agencies, CSOs, youth committees. So we believe in collaboration, and it could be also data collaboration with private sector, right? Number two is engagement of private sector and civil society. And this is of interest given today's topic, which is we promote investments, and we promote in presenting an appealing idea for private sector to come and invest in this particular domain. And we also understand that land restoration has real benefits, and real benefits that translate even for the private sector. And it doesn't need to be charitable in many contexts. Also, we encourage the engagement of private sector and mobilize the general public. And lastly, sharing knowledge and capacity building and accelerating exchange of best practices through this particular activity. Next slide, please. Right, so I would like to emphasize that this particular initiative is leveraged by the G20. And given that given that this initiative was started by G20, is already a win-win for us, because this important group understanding that it's not just economical aspect that they want to grow on, but would also like to take on this global challenge, is already a win-win for us. And the commitment is extremely bold. And also the exchange of best practices within these countries, the technology within this country, gives us some hope that we can take these technologies, best practices all around the world and implement this. Next slide, please. Right. Something that we are extremely keen on is the use of new generation technology and promoting new technology. It could be AI, it could be drone, robots, and I mean other things, remote sensing being also a pivotal part of, and I always advocate for data and having remote sensing in a strong data-specific advocacy as well. Next slide, please. Right, so going to the pillars of the initiative, we have 4 pillars: showcase and share, build capacity, engage private sector, and empower civil society. What is of interest for us is build capacity and engage private sector. But something, a pillar that I would invite all young people here to be engaged with us is showcase and share and empower civil society. So we can really, I would like to invite all of you to be a part of our initiative in these particular pillars. Next slide, please. So specifically with private sectors, what our major objectives is that we need to, as I said, we need to make restoration a good business case for these agencies. It could be through legal compliances, it could be through carbon credits that we heard about today from our previous speakers, it could be good corporate citizen ideas. So basically having a good case for restoration, and also partnering with agencies such as World Economic Forum or other private sector agencies. Next slide. And nurturing leadership. Now, this is, I think, of interest to all of us, which is we would like to bring in young people, but not just that. We would like to bring in politicians, and we would like to recognize people who have worked in this particular domain or who would want to work in this particular domain. We would like to encourage leadership in this particular domain. We would like to have a Nobel Prize for Land Restoration Initiative and hype it up so that, you know, it gets as much as attention as other initiatives or even climate change gets. Next slide, please. Now, just to give you a time frame of different initiatives, and why we are also appealing for young people to be involved in this particular initiative is because it is a long-term initiative. So it is going to be here till 2040. Which means that by the time it's 2040, we won't be youths anymore. We won't be young people anymore, but we can really steer the direction of how these initiatives are working with being involved. So as you can see, there's Bond Challenge, there's the LDN target, there is Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, there is NDC, there's NBSAP, but the G20 Global Land Initiative spans up to 2040. Next slide. And lastly, explaining how nature-based solution and land restoration habitat conservation are in sync and are in synergy. If you address one, the other is addressed. Next slide. Right. And I would also like to invite those who are going to COP to please follow us. We are there in our Land and Drought Pavilion. We will be there. I will be there personally in the first week. So if you're interested to join us, please join us. Those who are not there physically, we are live streaming most of our events. So please stay tuned and follow us. Next slide, please. This is going to be my last slide, and you can find my email address there if you want to know more about our work, and if you want to know more about our engagement, feel free to write to me there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Devashree, for the presentation. We're also moving towards our last speaker for today. There's Dr. Nidhi. Just confirming you. Yeah, I see you there. So Dr. Nidhi is again a notable figure in sustainability science and geospatial analysis. She's a senior fellow and program lead for nature, climate, and health at UNU. Chris, the floor is yours. You're on mute.
So thanks, everyone. Yeah. I'm glad to be speaking to all of you, and I'll share some insights from the work we are doing to bridge science, society, and science policy interface. We serve as a UN think tank on implementation of sustainable development goals from the point of governance. And I'm also representing PEDRR here, and PEDRR is one of the co-organizers of this event. So I'm sure you all know about the platform and its various activities, emphasizing on the triple planetary crisis where biodiversity, climate stability, exemplified living in harmony with nature, pollution and climate stability have a deep intersectionality. So there are no, we should not be looking for solutions that addresses one. We should be looking for interconnections, addressing intersectionality, and integrated approach to handling all the three crises and how they directly or indirectly interact with each other. And you've heard some of these insights already with in form of initiatives, engagements, projects and activities that the previous speakers alluded. Well, this ecosystem approach, which sort of also brought the biodiversity matters on board high-level political forums, state and community leaders, was Millennium Ecosystem Report of 2005. Having involved in this report while I was just doing my postdoc at that time was a sort of an eye-opener, because where a lot was done in terms of documentation, but these insights were not flowing into any policy. This remained more or less a documentation and sort of fancy frameworks that was making its way into academia, into research, but the science policy interface remained very weak. And slowly and gradually, we have started to see ecosystem services, whole of these narratives, the terminology, the concepts being now seen in different policies, including the biodiversity policies, the climate action documents to some extent, but also the ecosystem restoration paradigm becoming more prominent. So you can already see, more or less, I map it with my professional career, but you already see we are 20 years down from this assessment. And still we, in terms of measurable goals, we've only come across a fair level of success. A lot of ground to cover, and with sustainable development goals after the Millennium Development Goals ending in 2015, the emphasis on natural systems, nature-oriented sustainable development goals was quite prominent, because MDGs were criticized to be more or less focusing on the social issues and more humanitarian related paradigms. But SDGs was then evaluated as something which is more balanced for economics, for nature, for people, and also for the development paradigms that evolve around these three main categories. Alongside, as a part of this global assessment report on from the International Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, we also brought forth, and this was a huge work. I was among 300 scientists working together to identify current trends and patterns of biodiversity loss, sometimes indirect indicators that have not been positioned rightly in the biodiversity management governance discourse. For example, 80% global wastewater is discharged untreated into the environment. So the connection between water quality management, wastewater treatment, and impact on biodiversity. So these were some of the narratives that we were positioning in this report. This was a massive exercise of also positioning nature and human well-being in the center of biodiversity protection. So sort of, again, from a protectionism viewpoint to more or less the viewpoint of human well-being. So this was a repositioning of biodiversity conservation from a human well-being perspective. And the conceptual framework talks, I'm sure you must have seen this before, it talks very much to the relationship between man and nature as crucial to biodiversity conservation, ecosystem protection, and restoration. Well, we had a massive task in hand when we had to summarize the 500-page report into one diagram. And we took, I must say that it was more difficult than writing the report itself, because we just had to present this to the policymakers so that it can make its way to the policy documents, to implementation and actions and policies, project fundings, financing, etc. So this was the diagrams. This was one of the visual I wanted to show. We could identify leveraging points, the gaps in multi-level governance, the interventions as levers. So already there are institutions, there are policies, there are mechanisms upon which we should build rather than creating new institutions. So sort of levers, leverage points, and where the attention should go in terms of investment, in terms of directing resources, technical, human capacity, etc. So this was, I just wanted to show that doing science is one segment of the work, whether you want to address biodiversity loss, pollution control, or climate crisis, and then taking that message to the policymakers, to stakeholders, is another big chunk of work, which we often don't do enough. One of the other things that UNU is crucially involved, and of course, I have contributed to all these reports in the sense to position water as also a medium through which biodiversity loss, ecosystem restoration and conservation can be handled. So sort of integrated planning. The nature-based solutions for water was one big report in 2019, where we again repositioned water sector, water management, water governance, taking into note the ecosystem services, the biodiversity profiling of hydrologic ecosystems, the water cycle. So sort of multiple entry points to conserve biodiversity. And this remains super important if we have to take this whole idea of integrated planning, transdisciplinary approaches, multidisciplinary documentation. The crux of the matter is to influence policymakers, to influence communities and agencies and institutions from a sectoral level, so they can have a common terminology to think, they can plan common action, they're able to sit down on a table with all the stakeholders. So these are different documentations that have helped us in traversing those boundaries. We also compiled a work on multifunctional wetlands, again from and these are a couple of other reports from different UN agencies where we were involved. But to just give you one example is the investment strategy for reducing disaster risk and coastal pollution using nature-based solutions. So these are the same mangrove species or mangrove vegetation, coastal vegetation that was positioned from the viewpoint of ecosystem protection or biodiversity management. But now the same ecosystem, the same biodiversity profile is now pitched as an investment strategy for eco-DRR, from an eco-DRR perspective, disaster risk reduction and nature-based solutions. So we have the same ingredients, but we are trying to now compile them to align with emerging paradigms like nature-based solutions, ecosystem approach to disaster risk reduction, climate adaptation, so that you're able to preserve and conserve coastal biodiversity, including mangrove ecosystems, from multiple paradigms. And that also facilitates how funding is channeled through these different channels coming from the climate funding, the ecosystem restoration funding, and an investment strategy that we proposed was also enhancing a public-private partnership where community bonds. So as a community person, if you are putting sweat equity into restoration of mangrove ecosystems, through those bonds, you can also have some returns. And from a theoretical or academic viewpoint is a discount rate. And I'm not going to that because most of these solutions will not give you any returns in a short time period. So discount rate is a very crucial element of bargaining the return of investment after a time period, be it 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. In case of mangrove or coastal vegetation, it could be 10, 20 years. So when you're pitching this for investment to a private sector, you need to clarify the discount rate that after 5 years, you might have a developing coastal belt, but your coastal forest or coastal vegetation to give returns on this investment will be ranging from 10 to 20 years. And this may differ for different solutions that you will propose. So science and economics of these solutions remain crucial bargaining points to involve financing partners. And these are some of the things that we have been investigating from in-depth investments. Have recently compiled a book on influencing the engineering community. So water resource engineering, but also transport engineering. And transport engineering also involves the use of waterways, for example. But the long story short of this book is that we have made a case for natural resource systems, water systems, wetlands, land systems as an investment strategy through a ecosystem restoration paradigm, which the UN subscribed to in 2000 in the UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration, which I will just show you in a minute. And to sort of outline guiding principles, and some of the things that you see on the screen I have teased out at least 4 guiding principles, and these aspects remain crucial to impact investing. There's some private sector actors are now able to sit on the table and argue that, okay, we are investing for an impact. It's just not corporate social responsibility or some corporate fund going for ticking the box in your books that we are green and sustainable in our business, but to ensure that your investment has an impact for community, for individuals, for nature, and larger resilient future for all. I'll not again go into detail, but again, another crucial example, after 5 years of research funded by the RC UK, the Research Council of United Kingdom, we investigated how seaweed aquaculture systems can have both mitigation, adaptation impacts from a climate viewpoint, but also helps to protect coastal biodiversity, vegetation, if the aquaculture farming is integrated with natural coastal vegetation landscape. So this again was done at a global level in 5 countries, and the message was sort of compiled in form of policy briefs, 5 policy briefs covering the context of Africa, Asia, and Europe, because the conditions, the socioeconomic conditions, the social-cultural profiles is very different in these geographic settings. For example, in